Using his optimal logic, Keith found that 20 dexterity was still not enough to activate windwalking. To avoid bullets at a close distance, he needed at least 40 dexterity. If he encountered a submachine gun, he needed at least 60 dexterity. Besides dexterity, he also needed a strong reaction time and powerful eyesight. If he wanted to protect himself, he still had a long way to go. He walked to White Pine Gardens and showed his key at the entrance to the building. Only then did the security guard let him in. The property management certainly wasn't slack here. Keith found the right apartment and let himself in. The renovation wasn't bad, and there was a spacious living room, kitchen, and bathroom. There was also a master bedroom with an ensuite and 2 guest rooms. He nodded in satisfaction and pushed open the door to the main bedroom. But the scene that greeted him gave him a shock. Lying on the large bed was a body. Keith's first reaction was that he'd encountered a murderer. However, the soft snoring made him heave a sigh of relief. Then he frowned slightly. Why was there a woman sleeping in the room? He thought perhaps he'd entered the wrong apartment, and he went to take a look at the door number. It was indeed the house that he'd rented. Keith hesitated for a moment, then decided to wake the woman up and ask her about it. Daria Asan, the young woman asleep in Keith's new home, was awoken by a light pat on the shoulder. She shot up like a frightened rabbit, only to see a strange but handsome young man looking at her. She instinctively pulled the blankets close around herself, then opened her mouth as if about to shout, but Keith's movements were too fast. His hand covered her mouth, and she couldn't make a sound. Daria was so frightened that tears immediately sprang into her eyes. Keith was angry and amused at the same time, and he said, "I'm the new tenant. I'll let you go, but don't yell, okay?" Hearing this, Daria let out a heavy sigh of relief and nodded her head. Keith smiled and said, "So do you want to tell me why you're trespassing on private property?" Daria replied, "I ran away from home and had nowhere to go." She was very beautiful, and her pitiful expression would melt even the hardest heart. Keith was surprised, and he said with some amusement, "You ran away from home? Isn't that a bit of a cliché?" "It's true," Daria exclaimed, and she began to explain the story. It turned out that her parents had emigrated, but Daria didn't want to stay in their new home. She'd left them a note and secretly returned to the USA. The apartment originally belonged to her family, but because they wanted to emigrate, they sold it to the agency at a low price. Daria hadn't brought much money back with her, and she'd soon become destitute. But she still had the keys to this apartment, so she'd been staying there in secret since returning. The security guards knew her well, and they let her in without question. She'd only been back about a week, and the realtors hadn't discovered her yet. Keith frowned slightly. He used optimal logic to assess her story and found that there was no flaw in her words. He glanced at the ID and passport on the nightstand and decided he could believe her. But even if this girl was penniless and beautiful, why should he let her live in the apartment he was renting? Daria seemed to have seen through Keith's thoughts and said with some grievance, "Oh, when I start making money, I promise I'll pay rent." "Make money?" Keith asked curiously. "You're asleep in the middle of the day. How are you planning to make money?" Daria pointed at the computer proudly and said, "I'm a streamer. I'm one of the top players in League of Legends. You want me to teach you some tricks?" "What?" Keith smiled. He had recently acquired the Master of the Game skill. He didn't need any help in that area, but this girl was so pitiful. If he threw her out, he would feel so unreasonable. But he didn't really want to share his living space with her. After all, he was a man with secrets. Just as he was puzzling over this dilemma, the system's voice suddenly sounded in his mind.
Energy crystal detected.
What? Keith thought in surprise.
The system needs energy when upgrading, and the crystal can provide energy. For every unit of energy crystal you acquire, you can randomly obtain a maximum level skill.
Keith was delighted by this news and asked the system, "Where's the energy crystal?" The system replied,
It's hanging on Daria's neck.
Keith saw an emerald pendant hanging around Daria's neck, just as described. It must be the energy crystal. Driven by the temptation of a new skill, Keith smiled and said, "I suppose I could take you in, but there are conditions." Daria saw Keith staring straight at her chest. She hurriedly covered herself with her hands and yelped, "Don't even think about it." Keith smiled and said, "Think about what? I just want the emerald pendant around your neck." "Emerald pendant?" Daria heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, she looked at the necklace and asked curiously, "I bought this a while ago. It was only a few $100s. What do you want this for?" Keith said with a faint smile, "You don't need to worry about that. Give me the pendant. Otherwise, you can leave." "All right." Daria smiled and handed the necklace to Keith. "But leave me alone now. I'm going back to sleep." Keith took the pendant with satisfaction and heard the system say,
You've collected an energy crystal and therefore obtained a random skill. The system will draw it for you now. Please wait a moment.
After a pause, it went on.
You've obtained the skill Instrument Proficiency. You can use any musical instrument to play music as you wish.
"You want me to work in the music industry?" Although Keith had really wanted a skill to enhance his combat power, this skill was still okay. After all, having any new skill was a good thing. He came back to the present situation and realized that Daria had already fallen asleep again. He had originally wanted her to give him the master bedroom, but seeing how tired she was, he smiled, unbothered by the matter. He could stay in the guest room, for now.
You've fulfilled Daria's wish. Wish value, +1. Current progress, 3 of 10.
How could this woman sleep so soundly in front of a stranger? She didn't look like a scheming person. Keith smiled and looked at the time. It was almost 5 o'clock in the afternoon. After hesitating for a moment, he decided to go shopping. Now that he had money, he didn't need to struggle so much. He'd moved into a new place and planned to upgrade all his daily necessities to new, improved ones. Keith first went to the electronics store and ordered a top-of-the-range computer. After that, he went to Target to stock up on necessities for his pantry and the rest of the house. Since he had the culinary mastery skill, he could now cook delicious food for himself. By the time he returned home, it was dark, and his new computer had already been delivered. He nodded to the doorman and took his groceries into the house. But before he could catch his breath, a voice suddenly screamed, "Ah, Zephyr!" This Zephyr is such a scammer. Needless to say, his beautiful gamer roommate must have started her live stream. Keith rolled his eyes and went to prepare dinner. In her room, Daria was watching the comments roll in and chatting with their audience. She'd been doing live streams for a week and had gained a strong following based on her skill, cheerful character, and beautiful appearance. Currently, the number of people following her stream was about 100,000. Daria had also signed a new contract with the platform. Suddenly, a delicious fragrance wafted into her room. Daria wrinkled her nose like a kitten and giggled. It smells so good. Looks like someone has finished cooking. Guys, I'm going to go eat. The next live stream starts at 9 o'clock. Ignoring the flurry of comments, Daria closed the live stream and opened her door, excited to see dishes on the dining table. Looks like I don't have to eat instant ramen tonight. Keith raised an eyebrow at her, but she was too stunning to be mad at for long. Daria had seemed kind of cute before, but now, wearing a long dress and light makeup, she was an all-out beauty. Daria seemed to have seen through Keith's thoughts and giggled. What's up with you? I'm pretty, right? Lucky you, getting to rent with a beauty like me. Keith smiled as Daria dished up a plate for herself and started to eat. Her stomach had been growling just from the smell, and her face lit up as she realized that it tasted even more delicious than it smelled. You made all this yourself? Oh my God, it's so delicious. Daria munched on another mouthful before saying, Dude, if you cooked for me like this every day, I'd be your girlfriend for sure.
You fulfilled Daria's wish to eat. Wish value +1. Current progress 4 of 10.
Keith rolled his eyes at her as he loaded up his plate. He muttered, My name's Keith. Keith? Daria answered vaguely. She stuffed another piece of pork belly into her mouth, her eyes full of satisfaction and enjoyment. A little while later, Daria, who had already finished her third helping, leaned back in her chair. She looked at Keith, who was cleaning up, and said in admiration, I didn't see it before. Not only are you good looking, but you're talented too. Don't worry, I'll pay you back for all this. Within 3 days, I'll increase your gaming skills so much that you'll be the envy of all your friends. How about it? League of Legends was a popular game all over the world. High-level skills would give him not only bragging rights, but also the ability to earn money by playing professionally or becoming a streamer. And players could join teams for the qualifying matches. In fact, it was quite a beneficial strategy. Keith said with a faint smile, Your technique is really that good? Daria patted her chest and proudly said, I'm a Grandmaster contestant at the top of the division. Keith thought of something and said, The top of the division? Then, do you often encounter pro players? Of course. Daria smiled and said, Hurry up and set up your computer. I already told my followers that I'm playing the qualifier match with a teammate tonight. Keith faintly smiled. He already had the master of the game proficiency. If he couldn't convert it into something beneficial, then it would be useless having it. An idea formed in his mind. He nodded and said, All right, I'll play a few rounds with you. Keith set up his new computer and installed all the games and programs he needed. By the time he'd finished all of that, it was exactly 9 o'clock.
You've fulfilled Daria's wish. Wish value +1. Current progress 5 of 10.
He was in his room, talking to Daria via voice transmission. After adjusting his equipment, He loaded the platform and found Daria's live stream. Although her popularity was pretty average, she had a lot of comments. He didn't realize Daria had already started the live stream while he was testing his new microphone. Now, all kinds of comments about him appeared on the screen. Daria, your friend's voice is really nice. Does he have his own stream? His voice is nice. He's definitely a newbie. Our Daria's going to be snatched away. I hope a pro player will come and crush his gigolo. There were all kinds of comments. However, many of the people in the live stream were men who came for Daria's beauty. They were obviously hostile towards him. If they knew that he and Daria were under the same roof, he didn't know how they would react. As he entered the game, someone suddenly revealed that there was a pro player on the other side. Daria was shocked when she heard that, and after checking, she let out a wail. The other side is Apollo and Pumpkin's alternate account. I brought a newbie with me. I might lose this round. The comments were very interesting. Many viewers couldn't wait to see Keith get trashed. At that moment, the voice of the system sounded in Keith's mind.
Master of the game skill activated.
Keith smiled. He didn't expect to meet a pro player in the first round, but it was a pleasant surprise. He quickly started the game. There were 2 pro players on the other side, but they didn't seem to care about the other players at this stage. They chose Machiavelli and Prince for entertainment. Even if they were only up against a few heroes, they still weren't skilled enough at this stage to challenge them. Daria chose the female police officer who was the best, but Keith used a giant bug to support her. This made the audience laugh. The bug's support ability wasn't strong, and it would be easily abused. Sure enough, when it reached level 1, it was still all right. But when it reached level 2, Prince had the second EQ combo, and the situation began to turn against them. Anyone who played League of Legends knew that Machiavelli and Prince's teamwork was very clever and could easily defeat their opponents. They crossed the line fiercely, trying to force Keith and Daria out of the experience zone. At this time, the system's voice in Keith's mind rang again.
Optimal logic activated.
Keith pulled himself together again and used his powerful skill to calculate their position and Daria's movement trajectory. But the others didn't know what he was doing. What is he doing? Is this a new move? If he can't beat them, he should at least force them to leave and let the others attack them. He's at most a gold rank. He's a very weak contestant. What a shame. The audience criticized Keith openly. Although Daria continued to interact with them calmly, in her heart, she felt very helpless. She had originally intended to thank Keith and help him obtain some points. In addition, if she helped Keith win, it would also show her outstanding skills, but she didn't expect that they'd be on the back foot only a few minutes into the game. And even worse, it had happened on a live broadcast. It seemed like she would lose a lot of fans tonight. The competition was in a deadlock for a moment, and the energy of the cannon was about to be depleted. Daria wanted to replenish some energy while their opponent wasn't being as aggressive, but the moment she lifted the gun barrel, Machiavelli appeared out of nowhere and ignited the cannon. It was obviously a trap he'd set up. Daria felt that things were utterly hopeless. She was still within range of Prince's attack, but she didn't expect Keith to move even faster. The moment Machiavelli appeared, Keith appeared as well. This meant Machiavelli didn't have a chance to use any skills besides stun and ignition. At the same time, Keith used his new skill to step on Prince. Prince, who hadn't used any skills at the beginning, wasn't even comparable to a super soldier. Keith, on the other hand, ignited Machiavelli. The tables had turned in an instant. Daria finally reacted. She pulled away from them and started attacking Machiavelli like crazy. Machiavelli couldn't use his skills, so he couldn't leave. He caused Keith to lose some of his health points and fell down unwillingly. Prince, on the other hand, had already run away when he saw that the situation was turning against them. Keith had successfully counterattacked using high-end skills to defeat a pro player. Daria screamed in excitement. Her followers were silent for a moment before they began to praise Keith enthusiastically. But others thought that Keith had just been lucky. The newbie couldn't possibly have such fast reactions and perfect execution. In the PT training base, the two young men looked at each other and saw the shock in each other's eyes. The coach happened to be there and saw their reaction. He walked over curiously. "Did he get lucky?" Apollo frowned and said, "It's possible. Wait, let's go back in and see." The audience fell silent as Keith reminded Daria to move. "Be careful when you attack again later, because Prince will be coming for you." Sure enough, as soon as Daria started to fire, Prince arrived, but Daria was already prepared. She left the moment the flag was inserted. But Prince was a professional player after all. He could appear quickly when he used his skills, and he picked Daria up. Unfortunately, there was no one else around. Machiavelli, who wanted to catch up, was sent flying by Keith's giant bug. The level 6 bug caused a lot of damage. Machiavelli's health dropped low, and he was instantly killed. Keith's gaming skills were smooth, as if his every move was the result of a careful set of calculations. It was so coherent, it was unbelievable. The Master of the Game proficiency gave Keith extraordinary operating skills. He also knew the experience, attack, and other stats of every soldier who died. He knew the damage of a hero like the back of his hand. His optimal logic allowed him to predict the opponent's next move ahead of time. Everyone in the audience was shocked, and so was Daria. What a terrifying calculation and reaction ability. Daria screamed, "Keith, you're so strong." "He really is powerful." The audience cheered for Keith, flooding the chat with comments. "What kind of magical gameplay is this? Who said that Keith was a disgrace just now? Come out. Where did all those people who were insulting Keith go?" The audience was stunned by Keith's gameplay and were now all defending him. In the PT club base, a coach said to the player beside him, "You know anything about this person?" The player shook his head. The boss, who had appeared behind them, suddenly said, "Aqua, do you think they're lucky? Or do they actually have talent?" As one of the top players in the nation, Aqua had a good eye. He smiled bitterly and said, "Boss, there's no way this is his first time. Do you believe anyone could be that lucky?" The boss paused in surprise for a second before turning to the leader and saying, 3 minutes. I want to know everything there is to know about this guy." After showing off such incredible skills, the rest of the team all gave Keith a thumbs up. Some of them even asked if he wanted to go to the monsters to level up. Keith was only a supporting player, but his teammates all admired him. It was a big achievement so early on. Keith was calm in his heart. He'd already expected this kind of situation. But Daria looked at the growing popularity of her live stream and laughed loudly. "Keith, you're a genius. I've decided from now on, I'll bring you to play every day. Together, we'll become #1 in the country.
You fulfilled Daria's wish. Wish value +1. Current progress 6 of 10.
Daria boasted shamelessly. The audience was confused. Keith smiled and said, "Oh, let's not get ahead of ourselves just yet." His voice was gentle and pleasant to the ears, and there was a hint of playfulness in his tone. It captivated much of the audience instantly, and the comments began to flood in. "Keith, why don't you start your own live stream? I'll give you a gift." "Keith, do you have a girlfriend? I'll be your girlfriend." The audience was very enthusiastic. Even the people who insulted Keith started to praise him. All kinds of gifts were flying around in Daria's stream. There was even a new idea called Keith for Eva, who had given her 2 rockets. Keith was already amassing his own fan base. There were no more surprises in the game. Prince and Machiavelli were defeated, and Keith won easily. When the game ended, Daria's audience had reached 200,000, double what it had been when they'd started.
You fulfilled Daria's wish to increase the number of viewers in her live stream. Wish value +1. Current progress 7 of 10.
Daria smiled like a blooming flower. Everyone in the live stream begged for Keith to continue playing, and some even offered him expensive gifts to do so. Keith already had a plan, and he had nothing else to do right now, so he agreed.
You fulfilled Daria's wish. Current progress 8 of 10.
Sometimes, Keith thought, wish value was so easy to earn. In the next few rounds, Keith used a new champion and changed his strategy. With the skills he had from the system, even professional players would lose to him. In 3 rounds, he killed more than 70 people. His performance was captivating. The praise continued to flood in. Daria received an endless stream of gifts, many of which were given by new fans of Keith. The entire live stream was filled with excitement. Everyone wanted Keith to show his face. In the end, Keith couldn't resist the enthusiasm of the audience. He promised that after the college entrance exam, he would come online again with Daria, but he wouldn't appear every day, and the time wouldn't be fixed. Daria was beaming with joy. Thanks to Keith, the popularity of her live stream increased exponentially, and she received a lot of money. Keith successfully obtained another wish value. Currently, his progress was 9 of 10. He'd be able to make another wish very soon. Perhaps because he'd overused his skills, he felt a little dizzy. After he caught up with Daria, he took a shower and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The next morning, although Keith was still sleeping, he became aware of the sound of footsteps in his room. When he opened his eyes and saw that it was Daria, he let out a sigh of relief and said grumpily, "Don't you know it's rude to enter someone else's room without permission?" Daria said with envy, "Keith, the managers of PT and CMG contacted me early this morning. After seeing your performance yesterday, they want you to train." Keith was slightly surprised when he heard that, and then a smile appeared on his face. Last night, when he joined Daria on her live broadcast, it hadn't been on a whim. He'd had a plan all along. He didn't want to become a professional player, but he did want to use his master of the game proficiency to earn money. He smiled and said, "Tell the managers that the college entrance exam is coming up soon, and I don't want to be distracted." I'll talk to them about it after the exam, okay? Daria knew that Keith was taking the entrance exams, and she nodded and said, "Your fans gave you a lot of gifts last night. I'll transfer the money to you later." Keith nodded back and smiled to himself. Daria was a person with good morals. He knew she wasn't greedy, since she'd taken it upon herself to bring up the money he was owed. Keith said, with a faint smile, "I heard that your accounts are settled once every 6 months, right? You just started your channel. Let's talk about money later." After that, he asked curiously, "Do you have any money now?" Daria's face turned red. She lowered her head and lightly shook her head. Keith smiled and pulled out his phone to transfer $10,000 to her. "I'll lend you this," he said. "You can return it to me later." Daria opened her mouth and looked at Keith in a daze. There was a faint trace of tears at the corners of her eyes. For a moment, she was too stunned to speak. Keith smiled and said, "What? Do you want me to get dressed?" "Huh?" Daria came back to her senses and said with a red face, "No, I'm going to bed." She quickly turned and pushed open the door. Before she walked back into her room, she rubbed her eyes and looked back at Keith's room. After a moment, she seemed to realize something, and a bright smile appeared on her face. After breakfast, Keith went straight to the park and earned 2 attribute points and wish values. He added 2 attributes to his stamina, making his total attributes as follows: power, 15, dexterity, 20, stamina, 15, charm, 3. Skills: injury recovery, hammer fist, eye of detection, throwing proficiency, optimal logic, culinary mastery, instant memorization, master of the game, instrument proficiency, wind walking. At that moment, a system notification rang in his mind.
The host's current wish progress is 11 of 10. You can make a wish.
Keith now had 2 choices. Either he could obtain a skill that could increase his combat strength, or he could choose a practical skill to enrich himself. After hesitating for a long time, he made up his mind and said, "System, I wish for the ability to drive." Nowadays, a driver's license was essential, but Keith's family was poor. Even if he'd managed to get a license, there was no way he could afford a car.
Wish successful. Host obtains a skill, vehicle virtuosity. Description: host is able to expertly operate all means of transportation on Earth. You've obtained 1 charm value.
A cool feeling rushed into Keith's body as he realized that not only could he drive cars, but he could also drive airplanes, ships, helicopters, even spaceships. What's more, he'd be an expert in all of them. This is too powerful. He could hardly believe it. Just as he was getting excited, a notification from the system suddenly rang out.
System has detected that host overused spiritual energy earlier, causing him to reach a state of fatigue. The spiritual energies attributes have been activated. Please take a look at the details of the situation.
What? Keith thought. Another new attribute has been unlocked? Keith hurriedly checked his stats window and found that there was indeed the additional attribute of spiritual energy listed under his stamina. Right now, His spiritual energy was a little more than a normal person's, at 12 points. After carefully looking at the description, he came to a realization. No wonder after playing a few games yesterday, he'd felt dizzy and worn out. It turned out that Master of the Game and Optimal Logic had consumed a huge amount of his spiritual energy. This was just like the mana in League of Legends. Once a player's mana was used up, they were unable to use their abilities until they replenished it. Now that Keith's spiritual energy was activated, any other skills that required brain power would consume it. 12 spiritual energy points could maintain a skill for 4 hours. In other words, 1 spiritual energy point would power a skill for 20 minutes. When 2 skills were activated at the same time, the consumption of spiritual energy would be doubled. 1 spiritual energy would only last for 10 minutes. If Keith didn't have spiritual energy, he wouldn't be able to use any skills that consumed brain power. Looking at it this way, spiritual energy was an incredibly important attribute. Keith frowned and started thinking about how he could increase his spiritual energy points. He was a completely different person than before. He used to be poor, and even though he had the system now, he still thought about ways to make money. But things were different now. Money was important, but it was no longer the most important thing. He'd already learned from the system that if he obtained energy crystals, the system would level up, and he would obtain a huge benefit. As for what that benefit was, the system had already made it clear that the domain controlling function would be activated. As long as he grasped the domain controlling ability, his cultivation realm would increase along with it. This wasn't a physical ability like power and dexterity, but a realm one. Once he had a realm, he could unlock a magical power. If he could dominate many domains in the future, he could even become immortal. This was his ultimate goal. Compared to immortality, money was nothing. The reason he earned money was that he wanted to buy energy crystals to boost the system. He wanted to earn as much as possible so that the system could level up. This broadening of his horizons was accompanied by a change in Keith's state of mind. The boy from before had long disappeared. Now, even people like Magnus or Gwen Carrington were merely ants in his eyes. He was developing the mentality of a powerhouse. After puzzling over his situation for a long time, Keith decided it would be best to develop in a balanced manner and make himself an all-rounder. After figuring this out, he smiled and made his way to the bookstore. He still had a long way to go, and he knew that in order to succeed, he had to stay grounded. The most important thing right now was to get into Harvard. It would be best if he could get a top score on the entrance exam, as even that could be seen as dominating the area. Keith spent the whole morning reading textbooks. Just as he was about to go out and get lunch, his phone suddenly rang. It was his father, who excitedly filled him in. "That CEO wants to see me?" Keith said in surprise. Sam's excited voice came from the other end of the phone.
"Well, I didn't expect that you'd have an engagement with Strauss family so soon. You better dress up. You need to be there at 2 o'clock this afternoon."
After hanging up the phone, a wry smile appeared on Keith's face. The wish he'd made as a joke had now come true. The Strauss family was truly a powerful family. The grandfather of the Strausses had built an empire, and although he'd retired now, he was still highly influential, not only in Summerfield, but across the entire country. The old man had 3 sons, and the eldest was in politics. Currently, he was the number one figure in the state. The second son had served in the Army and was now the youngest and most promising general in the U.S. military. The third son was a businessman, and sadly, he died early, but not before passing his skills on to his highly capable daughter. Olivia Strauss was CEO of Olive Industries. On the surface, she had a total of $33 billion in assets and shares. Added to that, her family was so powerful that it made people's hair stand on end. Compared to Olivia, Magnus was nothing. Keith would never have imagined that the system would arrange for someone like her to be his wife. There were hotshots from all walks of life who wanted to secure Olivia's hand in marriage. All of a sudden, Keith had become their main target. Furthermore, he heard that Olivia was incomparably cold and elegant, and she had no interest in dating at all. If he ended up with a wife like that, he would be very lonely. But the benefits were also obvious. He could use the Strauss family's huge network to search for energy crystals. A connection to the Strauss family would also help him get into any industry he wanted. Thinking of this, Keith gazed at the sky. After a long period of silence, a faint smile appeared on his face. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, he arrived at the restaurant where they had agreed to meet. It was the most exclusive restaurant in Summerfield. Anyone who could afford to come here had to be important. The hostess glanced at the ordinary-looking young man in front of her, and although there was a hint of disdain in her eyes, she asked politely, "Sir, do you have a reservation?" Keith smiled and said, "Yes. May I ask where Olivia Strauss is sitting?" "Miss Strauss?" The waitress was shocked and quickly said, "You must be Mr. Sanderberg? I'll take you to her right away." Once she realized that Keith knew Olivia, the waitress immediately warmed up to him. She led Keith to a quiet corner of the restaurant where there was a table of 5 people. In the main seat sat an old man wearing casual clothes. He looked at Keith with a smile. On the other side of him were a young man and a woman. The man was about 26 or 27 years old, and he wore a suit. He looked handsome, but his eyes were filled with veiled hostility when he looked at Keith. The woman was wearing a relaxed black outfit. Her long hair hung down around her shoulders, framing a face that was truly beautiful. This woman was Olivia Strauss. Keith thought of all the beautiful women he'd seen before. But no matter if it was his ex-girlfriend, the young nurse from the hospital, or his beautiful gamer roommate, they paled in comparison to the woman before him. Only Quinn, his sergeant at the precinct, could come close, but Olivia looked at Keith with an unfriendly gaze, and the pretty girl beside her eyed him with undisguised disdain. Her eyes seemed to be saying, "A poor kid like you seriously thinks he's worthy of Olivia Strauss?" The hostess very sensibly withdrew. The first one to speak wasn't the senior gentleman at the head of the table, but Olivia. She snorted lightly and said, "You're late. I hate people who are late. You can go through the divorce procedures with me later." The first thing she said upon seeing him was that she wanted to divorce. Keith was slightly stunned. He looked at his watch, which showed 2:03 p.m. If that was the case, he really was 3 minutes late. He smiled and said, "Miss Strauss, we aren't married yet, so why would we have to go through a divorce procedure? If you're not happy with me, you can leave now and we won't get married at all." The group at the table was stunned. How dare this brat speak like that? in front of old Mr. Strauss. Was he too stupid to know any better? Or had he done it on purpose? The young man scoffed, and Olivia's pretty friend sneered. She'd seen this kind of attention-grabbing method countless times before. Olivia looked at Keith and said, "Fine, I'll leave." She got up and was just about to leave, but old Mr. Strauss frowned and said, "Sit down." Hearing this, Olivia gritted her teeth and looked at Keith hatefully. After hesitating for a moment, she finally sat back down. Old Mr. Strauss chuckled. "Keith, my granddaughter has a temper. Don't mind her. Now, shall we introduce ourselves?" Keith smiled and said, "Oh, sir, you're too kind. You're so famous. How could I not know who you are? You've dedicated your life to our country. Everyone knows and admires you." As he spoke, he looked at Olivia and said, "And Miss Strauss is often on TV. She's the most famous young entrepreneur in the country. Who wouldn't know her?" Olivia only looked at Keith coldly and didn't say a word. Keith didn't care about Olivia's frosty reception, though. He looked at the young man beside old Mr. Strauss and said, "And I believe this is the famous Deputy CEO of Olive Industries, Calvin Carter." Calvin nodded his head slightly. The disdain and hostility in his eyes became even stronger. His father and grandfather were old Mr. Strauss's confidants, and he'd become trusted enough that he'd been given the position of Deputy CEO. Calvin was one of Olivia's many admirers, and with the two families' close relationship, the rest of the world thought that the chances of him and Olivia getting married were very high. When Keith saw his expression, he laughed to himself. No matter who it was, if they dared mess with him, he'd send them straight to hell. He turned to the girl beside Olivia. She was beautiful too, but sat beside Olivia, she was totally overshadowed. Keith smiled faintly and said, "If I'm not mistaken, you're Sienna Young, daughter of the Young Corporation's chairman?" Sienna snorted lightly. She'd grown up with Olivia and was very close to the Strauss family. She spoke bluntly. "You're Keith Sanderberg, right? We've already figured out your background. I don't want to say anything too unpleasant in front of Mr. Strauss, but with your family background and financial situation, you and Olivia will never be together. I advise you to give up on the idea now." Keith smiled faintly. "I've heard of you, but that doesn't mean I know you. Let's not discuss whether or not you have the right to talk to me like that, even if you did. What makes you think I'd pay attention to you?" "You!" Sienna was furious, but she didn't know how to fight him. She stared at Keith hatefully, as if she was considering how to respond. Olivia's eyebrows wrinkled a little. She understood her friend well. Once she got angry, the scene could become very awkward. She gently pinched Sienna's hand under the table, indicating for her to calm down. Sienna took the hint and snorted lightly before turning away from Keith. The atmosphere was incredibly awkward, but old Mr. Strauss nodded to himself. He'd seen countless young people who were interested in his granddaughter, but no matter who they were, they had all been respectful in front of him, and they had all fawned over Sienna when they realized she was Olivia's best friend. He had invited Sienna today because he wanted to see how Keith behaved with her. Now he could see that Keith's attitude was neither servile nor overbearing. After being ridiculed, he responded with the same level of sarcasm, unwilling to take a loss but also holding his anger in check. In addition, Mr. Strauss had a feeling in his heart that Keith didn't care about their identities at all, There was even a trace of pride hidden in the depths of his eyes. He was a child from an ordinary family, but the way he held himself wasn't humble. It surprised Mr. Strauss and piqued his curiosity at the same time. Where did this young man's confidence come from? Old Mr. Strauss smiled and said,
"All right, that's enough, all of you. Keith, you know about the marriage between Olivia and yourself, yes? However, you were wrong just now about you two not being married yet. I've taken the liberty of settling the matter myself."
He nodded to Calvin, who took a red folder from his briefcase and handed it to Keith with a gloomy expression. Keith took a look inside and saw that it was his and Olivia's marriage certificate. The date was today, and it even had the signatures of the officiant and the witnesses. It had all been handled flawlessly. It went to show the power of the Strauss family. If a Strauss said the word, even a marriage certificate could be issued. This... Keith smiled wryly and said, "Sir, aren't you being a little hasty?" Old Mr. Strauss smiled back and said,
"I'm your grandfather's lifelong friend. We made an agreement. Besides, I'm afraid that my granddaughter wouldn't go through with it otherwise."
Olivia's face darkened. She hadn't even dated yet, and now she was being forced to get married. How could she not be angry? She looked angrily at Keith, the main culprit. She wanted to divorce him immediately, and then she wanted to send this damn man overseas. It'd be best if he didn't come back for the rest of his life. Keith saw her looking at him as if she wanted to eat him. He touched his nose, feeling a little guilty. On the surface, he was also a victim of an arranged marriage, but in truth, he was the one who had wished it into reality. Just then, the system piped up. The system has detected that the connection character Olivia Strauss has a negative opinion of the host, releasing the first system mission. Description: within 30 days, if you can change her attitude to a positive view of you, system will reward you with an unlimited chance to make a wish. If the mission fails, system will randomly deduct 3 skills from you. Keith frowned to himself as the system went on. Current intimacy of host and Olivia Strauss, -70. Mission target, intimacy of over 50. Keith was shocked. He didn't expect the system to start giving out missions. Moreover, this mission involved the concept of a system connection character. The system had scanned Olivia and confirmed her as the most suitable candidate for him to marry. That was why she'd become a relevant person. So, why was his and Olivia's intimacy score at -70? "The system," he said in his head, "where's my charm value? Why doesn't it have any effect on Olivia?" Olivia's charm value has been detected as higher than yours. Your charm value, therefore, has no effect on her. When Keith heard this, he suddenly understood. This young lady was powerful, talented, and beautiful, and she had money. Her charm value must be through the roof. In fact, everyone at the table had a pretty high charm value. No wonder they didn't have as good an impression of him as regular people. For the first time, he realized the importance of the charm attribute. The old man saw that Keith was in a daze and thought it was because Keith couldn't accept the arranged marriage. He smiled and said,
"Keith, you don't have to worry. Once you marry Olivia, you'll be part of Olive Industries. I'll make arrangements to take care of your parents and your sister as well. You can rest assured on that.
Mr. Strauss continued,
I'll also have my people take care of your wedding arrangements and photos later. But you have to care about these things, too.
Keith smiled wryly when he heard this, while Olivia's face became even darker. If her grandfather wasn't the person she respected most in the world, she would have left already. Sienna continued to sneer, while Calvin looked at Keith with venom in his eyes. Needless to say, the deputy CEO already hated Keith to the core. The old man seemed to ignore all of this, or perhaps he didn't want to point it out. He wanted Keith to solve it himself. The more he talked, the more animated he became. He even talked about the family name and education of their future children. Keith felt his scalp go numb when he heard this. All he wanted was to get the hell out of there. They chatted for a while longer, until the old man smiled and said,
I'm going to the bar. You young people should get to know each other.
He got up, refusing to let anyone else accompany him as he walked away in a good mood. Once he was gone, the situation turned even more awkward than it had been at the start. Calvin seemed to have held it in for a long time. He sneered and said, Keith, I've already investigated your background. Your grades are bad and your family is poor. You've no ability at all. I heard you were in a fight with a group of gangsters a few days ago. A person like you isn't worthy of being Olivia's husband. I'll give you $1 million to tell the old man that you want a divorce. The words were hurtful, and even Olivia frowned slightly. She wanted to say something, but she held back in the end. Keith just looked at Calvin calmly and said, And what if I refuse? You think $1 million isn't enough? Said Sienna. She sneered and went on, How much do you want? Name a price. Keith's expression remained indifferent. Sienna became more and more furious, and Whisper shouted, Keith, you haven't been to college, your personality is weak, and your family is nothing. The gap between you and Olivia is insurmountable. You must realize your own limitations. Don't you know these things? Keith's expressions turned cold, and he said, Is that so? If it wasn't for Mr. Strauss, trash like you would have been thrown out long ago. You asshole! Sienna's voice was ashen. Calvin said coldly, Keith, if we're trash, then what are you? What am I? Keith said faintly, I'm someone you cannot afford to offend. I'll give you one last warning. If you dare talk any more of this crap to me, I promise you'll regret it. At this moment, a faint aura burst out from Keith's body. The others were taken aback and didn't dare to refute him. Olivia was shocked. She'd followed her grandfather since she was young and had seen countless big shots. She was familiar with the look on Keith's face, but somehow on him, it was different. But deep down, she was still angry. She suddenly stood up and said, Well, what's the point of saying all this now? What can you prove? I don't care if you don't have any money. I don't even care if you're not that talented. What I'm disgusted about is that you don't act like a man. You can't even protect your girlfriend. How could you make me happy? Her words poked directly at Keith's sore spot, and he fell silent. Christina had left him. Although he had hit Blake, he still lost his girlfriend. This was his failure, and he couldn't deny it. And he'd made up his mind that he would recover his dignity, but right now, he really couldn't prove anything. He didn't say a word, but a bitter smile appeared on his face. Olivia realized that her words were a little too much, and her expression eased up. She sighed and said, "Let's get a divorce. We really aren't suitable for each other." Keith let out a breath of turbid air. He looked at the cold but beautiful girl in front of him and said with a faint smile, "If you have the power to get a marriage certificate, I think you have the power to get a divorce certificate as well. Can't you solve this problem by yourself? I just hope you don't regret it in the future." Olivia calmly said, "I never regret my choices." Just as she wanted to say something more, Calvin's phone suddenly rang. He hurriedly got up and said, "I'll go and find Mr. Strauss," and quickly walked away from the table. The two of them calmed down and didn't speak for a while, but the scene remained awkward. Keith was angry in his heart, but he stayed calm on the outside as he drank his coffee. His expression was indifferent, and he didn't say a word. After a while, Mr. Strauss returned with Calvin. The old man smiled and said,
"Keith, I heard you single-handedly defeated 3 bank robbers. In fact, I saw the video. You were amazing."
Keith smiled and said, "I was just lucky." Old Mr. Strauss was happy with Keith's response. He seemed most satisfied with the young man. At that moment, Calvin's phone rang again. He answered the call, and within seconds, his expression changed dramatically.
"Shit, Olivia, your mom has been kidnapped."
"What?" the others yelled in shock. Olivia's face fell, and she grabbed her phone to call her mother, but Calvin said with a trembling voice,
"The kidnapper's calling from your mom's phone."
Olivia's face turned pale. She was a strong woman, but she was still young. When faced with this kind of situation, she immediately panicked. Old Mr. Strauss said in a deep voice,
"Give me the phone."
Calvin handed it over, and Mr. Strauss listened for a minute before angrily throwing it to the ground. He gritted his teeth and hissed,
"There's someone out there who dares to do such a thing? Calvin, call the police and bring these criminals to justice."
Calvin said quietly,
"Sir, the kidnappers clearly stated that we can't call the police or they will kill her."
Olivia, whose face was ashen, said urgently, "Grandpa, if they want money, we'll give them money. We cannot risk Mom's safety." Old Mr. Strauss was silent for a moment. He seemed to have aged dozens of years in an instant. He waved his hand and said,
"The kidnappers told us to stay in the restaurant. Olivia, you sort out the funds. Calvin, go and empty the restaurant, and do it discreetly."
The two of them nodded and hurried away. Old Mr. Strauss sat back down and looked at Keith and Sienna, whose face was pale and frightened, and said,
"The kidnappers are afraid that you'll call the police if you leave, so they said you had to stay here. I know you're frightened. I'll make it up to you later."
Sienna had lost her sense of propriety, and she nodded in panic. Keith, on the other hand, had a calm expression, but there was a faint light flickering in the depths of his eyes. The Strauss family was very powerful. In less than 2 hours, a Mercedes pulled up outside the restaurant, carrying the cash. At that very moment, the kidnappers called again and instructed them to park the car 100 feet away. Moments later, an unmarked van drove over. A man in a mask got out and climbed into the Mercedes, but He didn't seem in a hurry to leave. Old Mr. Strauss received a call from the kidnapper. They had changed their minds. Not only did they want $100 million in cash, they also wanted 100,000 shares in Olive Industries. And there was another prerequisite. If Mr. Strauss could follow the Mercedes to the place where the contract was to be signed, the kidnappers would let Mia go. Otherwise, they would kill her. In addition, he wasn't allowed to take his own luxury car. He had to use the van that the kidnappers had arrived in. The kidnappers were clearly making things difficult for him. Old Mr. Strauss was burning with anger. These kidnappers sure were arrogant to make such demands of a man of his status. In any other situation, with just a phone call, the kidnappers would have vanished without a trace. But they had targeted the Strauss family's weakness. Mr. Strauss had no choice but to agree to their demands. He looked at the young men behind him and shook his head slightly. Back in his day, he had raced Formula One cars for fun. In terms of driving skills, none of the young men here could compare to him. But he was too old now.
Forget it.
Mr. Strauss sighed and said,
Olivia, Calvin, follow me into the van. Keith, Sienna, you two, go home.
Olivia's eyes turned red. She said anxiously,
Grandpa, it's too risky. Let me drive.
The old man shook his head and said,
A young woman like you can do this. I'll drive.
But Olivia wanted to say something, but the old man shook his head and said,
Don't say any more. Get in the van.
With that, he left. Olivia didn't dare to disobey and followed him with a resigned look. Keith said indifferently, Calvin, you don't know how to drive? Calvin looked at him and shook his head. Not even as well as Olivia. I'd only hold him up. Is that so? Keith smiled non-committally. He looked at the pale Sienna beside him and said, You can go home. He quickly got into the driver's seat and said, I'll drive. You'll drive? They were all slightly stunned. Calvin scoffed and said, You don't even have a license. You'll get us all killed. Olivia frowned and scolded him. Keith, don't mess around. Get out of the way. Old Mr. Strauss sighed and said,
Keith, I know what you think, but this isn't a joke. You can go. This has nothing to do with you.
Keith said with a faint smile, I'm still part of the police force. Since I'm here, this matter involves me. When the others heard this, they didn't know how to respond. And they remembered that Keith was the hero who had disarmed 3 serial bank robbers by himself. They saw that his expression was calm and a smile was still hanging on the corner of his mouth. His confidence made them feel reassured. Old Mr. Strauss was silent for a while, then nodded and said,
Okay, I trust you. Everyone in the car.
He was the first to sit in the passenger seat. Olivia saw this and didn't say anything else. She got into the car as well. Keith saw that Calvin was hesitating. He said in surprise, You're not coming? Calvin said seriously, The old man often says not to put all your eggs in one basket. I'll drive my car and follow you. Old Mr. Strauss nodded and said,
Don't get too close. Keith, there's no time to lose. Let's go.
The corner of Keith's mouth curled up. A notification from the system sounded in his mind.
Vehicle virtuosity activated.
He took the steering wheel with one hand and revved the engine loudly. After a second, The van sped off like a sports car. In less than 10 seconds, the van was at full speed. The old man sucked in a cold breath, and his eyes widened in disbelief. He'd seen his fair share of expert drivers, but none of them could handle a van like this. In the back, Olivia was also surprised by Keith's driving skills. The van sped down the crowded road at a breakneck speed. It was amazing. The people on the sidewalk stopped to watch in shock. "Is that a getaway van?" "It looks like it's flying." "Hey, is that Lewis Hamilton driving?" The pedestrians exclaimed one after another. The traffic officer was similarly flabbergasted. She'd seen many illegal acts in her time, but this was the first time she'd seen someone weaving in and out of the traffic so fast in a van. Inside the vehicle, Olivia's jaw dropped open in disbelief. She needed to fire the guy who was investigating Keith's background. He didn't have a driver's license. With his skills, he could get a racing license. The old man's eyes widened too. He stared fixedly at Keith as if he'd already forgotten that his daughter-in-law had been kidnapped. He'd lived for so long, but he'd never seen anyone drive like this.
You've satisfied Mr. Strauss's wish to appreciate the art of driving. Wish value +1.
Current progress 4 of 10. Although Keith had earned another wish value, he smiled bitterly. When the old man saw this, he asked curiously,
"Keith, what's wrong?"
Keith sighed and said, "The brakes are broken."
"What?"
The old man and Olivia were even more shocked. They were going at 110 miles per hour. If the brakes were broken, it meant they could die at any second. Olivia's face turned pale. The old man had been through a lot, and he frowned and asked,
"Could it be that the kidnappers did something to the van?"
Keith nodded in silence. Olivia took a deep breath and forced herself to calm down. She asked in a low voice, "Keith, is there any way to make the van stop?" "Stop?" Keith smiled and said, "Won't all our efforts be in vain if we stop now? Sit tight." As he spoke, he hit the gas to the floor. The van's engine produced a violent roar, and it shot forward at an even faster speed than before. With its broken brakes, the van sped away. Olivia didn't dare to look anymore. She closed her eyes and entrusted her life to the man in the driver's seat. Old Mr. Strauss, on the other hand, looked on in shock. In the face of such a soul-stirring moment, Keith was smiling. There was a faint confidence in his eyes. His expression didn't change at all. What kind of person was he? 5 minutes later, the van was out of the city center. The number of cars on the road decreased, and Keith could clearly see the Mercedes not far ahead. But he couldn't see Calvin's car in the rearview mirror. After frowning slightly, he seemed to think of something, and a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. Feeling that the car was no longer speeding out of control, Olivia instinctively opened her eyes. After seeing the scene in front of her, she let out a slight sigh of relief. Old Mr. Strauss also exhaled heavily.
"Keith, you're catching up to the car in front. You should change gears and think of a way to slow us down."
Keith smiled bitterly and said, "The transmission's broken too. It's nothing more than decoration." Olivia stared at Keith and asked, "Do you have any way to slow down? If you get us there in one piece, I promise I'll go on a date with you after." "A date?" Keith turned to look at her. He smiled faintly. Miss Strauss, I thought you wanted a divorce. Don't worry. I don't plan to make you suffer. Olivia's face turned pale, and then she blushed. She hadn't liked Keith before, but she knew that if it wasn't for him, if it was her or her grandfather driving this car, they would have crashed long ago. Along the way, she'd witnessed Keith's abilities. Right now, the only thing she could rely on was this young man. Olivia wasn't an idiot. On the contrary, she was very smart. If it was someone else, she might have made a huge promise. But with the temperament that Keith had displayed earlier, as well as the abilities that he displayed now, perhaps the money wouldn't be able to move him. And what she was most confident in wasn't her identity as CEO, but her appearance. That was why she said that she would agree to the date. In her opinion, no man would reject an offer of a date with her, but she didn't expect Keith to simply reject her, and he had even faintly mocked her. There were countless men who wanted to go on a date with her, but Keith had actually rejected her. This made her a little angry, but she couldn't fly into a rage. A strange feeling grew in her heart. Keith naturally didn't care what Olivia was thinking. A light flashed in his eyes, and he fiercely turned the steering wheel. The van started spinning rapidly. He was relying on the friction to slow it down, and he actually did it. It was truly amazing. The people on the sidewalk gasped in disbelief. He's the god of driving. People took out their phones and started filming, wanting to upload the miraculous scene to the internet. After a while of spinning, the van slowed down to 60 miles per hour until finally it was able to follow the Mercedes at a steady pace. Old Mr. Strauss was already numb with shock. Keith's driving skills were powerful. If he ever took up racing, he could easily win a championship. The key was that Keith was calm and confident. Old Mr. Strauss had made up his mind that once this was over, he would make sure to keep Keith and his granddaughter together. A person like Keith was worth more than all her other suitors put together. 15 minutes later, at the top of a remote mountain road, the Mercedes stopped. There was a lonely villa in front of them. Keith keenly noticed that there was a huge object wrapped up in the open space behind the villa, but he couldn't see what was inside. The Mercedes stopped, but the van didn't. It seemed impossible to stop it safely. Of course, it would have been difficult for anyone else, but for Keith, nothing was impossible. He drove them into the bumpy field so the grass would slow them down. Then, aiming the van at a building not far away, he drove straight at the wall, where something miraculous happened. After a sharp spin, Keith crashed the gap between the van's wheels perfectly into two steel bars extending from the concrete wall. The wheels were crushed under the impact, but the van was fixed firmly in place and stopped instantly. This was simply inconceivable. With a dull thud, Keith kicked open the door and was the first to climb out. Old Mr. Strauss and Olivia shook their dizzy heads and slowly followed him. Mr. Strauss was old, but strong. Other than feeling a little shaken, he was fine.
You fulfilled Olivia and Mr. Strauss's wish to get out of the vehicle safely. Wish value +1. Current progress 5 of 10. You shattered the kidnapper's wish to kill you in a car accident. Attribute point +1.
At that moment, the kidnapper in the Mercedes jumped out and gave Keith a thumbs up. Then he raised his finger and signaled them to enter the villa. When Mr. Strauss saw the scene, he slowly walked towards the villa with Olivia's help. When he passed Keith, he said,
Keith, you did well. The next part only concerns Olivia and me. You can wait outside.
Keith was silent. Sure, this wasn't his problem. He'd already saved the lives of the two of them. Even if he turned back now, he wouldn't have any psychological burden. Furthermore, what Olivia had said earlier had made him angry. He looked at Mr. Strauss, whose face was still pale, and then looked at the anxious Olivia. Although she didn't say anything, the trace of desire in her eyes couldn't be hidden. Under such circumstances, she would, of course, be afraid. She would also hope to have someone she could rely on. Keith let out a long sigh. Suddenly, he smiled and said, "These kidnappers almost killed me. I think I should get some kind of revenge." Then he took the lead and walked forward. Old Mr. Strauss's face revealed a gratified smile, while Olivia stared blankly at Keith's back. What she said previously was so unpleasant that it hurt his heart, but he still decided to defend her at such a critical moment. There was a moment when she was enveloped by a sense of guilt, but there was also a sense of security that filled her heart.
You fulfilled Olivia and Mr. Strauss's wish of being accompanied by you. Wish value +1. Current progress 6 of 10.
A dull sound was heard as Keith sent the door of the villa flying with a powerful kick. He stepped into the villa, but the scene in front of him shocked him. In the spacious hall sat a woman in expensive clothes, but her mouth was gagged and her hands were tied. The woman's body was covered with strange wires, and the other end of the wires was connected to a piano. Around the woman stood 4 or 5 men in black. They were wearing masks, and the guns in their hands were all pointed at Keith. "Mom!" Olivia saw her mother all tied up and cried out in alarm. She wanted to rush forward, but she was pulled back by Keith. The woman also shook her head vigorously, motioning for her daughter not to come over. Old Mr. Strauss slowly walked in and looked at his daughter-in-law. Then he said in a deep voice,
"Where's the person who signed the contract? Show yourself."
A round of applause sounded from the second floor. A young man wearing a monkey mask walked down and said with a smile, "Old Mr. Strauss, you're very calm. But before signing the contract, I thought of another condition." This young man was using a voice changer, and his tone was harsh. He pointed at Olivia and said, "Miss Strauss, I've admired you for a long time. If you're willing to stay and accompany me for a night, I can guarantee that the Strauss family will leave here safely. What do you think?"
"No way,"
Mr. Strauss shouted angrily.
"If you dare to touch a hair on my granddaughter's head, you won't even live long enough to regret it."
The man laughed loudly and said, "Old man, if you make me angry, we'll die together."
"You bastard."
Mr. Strauss was so angry that he could hardly stand still. The man sneered. Well, Mrs. Strauss, have you thought about it? If you say no, not only will you die, but your mother will also be electrocuted. You don't want to see that happen, right? Olivia's face turned pale. She gritted her teeth, but she looked at her grandfather and Keith beside her. Then she looked at her mother, whose face was full of tears. Wait a minute. Before Olivia could say anything, a voice echoed through the room. Blake and the bodyguard both gasped at the same time. How is this possible? Keith, this... Blake was so scared that his voice trembled and he stuttered badly. But his bodyguard was well trained. Titan's expression went from stunned to normal in a single moment. Then, he began moving toward Keith again. He kicked out at Keith's head.
Hammer fist proficiency activated.
Keith was fast enough to avoid the attack, and he turned gracefully and landed a kick to the bodyguard's knees. But Titan was more stable than he'd expected. The huge bodyguard gave the tiniest wobble, but the full-force kick wasn't nearly enough to topple him. Clearly, Keith was still not strong enough. However, he still had his hammer fist proficiency, and he put it to use by quickly yanking the bodyguard's feet out from under him. This time, his strategy was good enough, and Titan finally lost his balance and crashed to the ground. Keith used his advantage to attack. He kicked the bodyguard's head, and Titan blacked out on the spot. Within 3 attacks, he'd been able to defeat this man too. It was sheer luck that he'd still had the stones to throw at them earlier on, but this time around, it was all him. He was a real fighter, and this was his very own victory. Blake's face was as blank and pale as a sheet of paper. He was no longer the arrogant jerk he'd been just minutes earlier. Now, he was eyeing Keith in terror. Christina was scared too. She never expected her ex-boyfriend to be so powerful. By this time, the show had attracted a crowd of passers-by. They looked on with wide eyes and began to murmur to each other. Whoa, this kid's powerful. Is he a Marine? A martial arts expert? If I had a man like that, I'd never be scared again. The crowd swelled until the garden was flooded with the sound of excited chatter. Keith didn't care about any of these things. He stepped boldly towards Blake. It seemed like he really was going to break his legs. Blake was in a state of complete fear and horror. His entire body trembled to the point where tears fell from his eyes. He stared at Keith and shook his head as he pleaded, No, don't come any closer. But Keith was no longer in his right mind. His anger had taken over his rationality, and he didn't care about anything but revenge. He walked towards the trembling man and looked down at him. Slowly, he crouched down and raised his fist. This is my revenge. I'm going to crush you. But before he could do anything else, Christina rushed over. She grabbed Keith's raised hand and pleaded in a shaky voice, Keith, don't be so impulsive, please. Keith looked at her and suddenly came back to himself. If he hurt Blake any further, he could be convicted of deliberately harming him. And even if that didn't happen, he could still incur the wrath of the Carrington group. And that was a sure way to put a target on his own back. After all, he had no power or influence. He hardly even had any money. There was no way he could win against someone like Blake, who had such a strong background. He looked at Christina, and his expression softened. He said indifferently, You're right. Oh, thank God. But before Christina could actually breathe a sigh of relief, She heard the second half of Keith's sentence, and it shook her to her core. "But I'm Keith Sanderberg, and I'm utterly ruthless." With that, he punched Blake mercilessly in the face. Crack! The crowd heard the sound of Blake's nose breaking, followed by his ear-splitting scream. The garden fell silent. Some of the spectators had wanted to intervene and break up the fight, but now they cowered back instead. They didn't want their bones broken too. This young man really was as ruthless as he'd said.
You crushed Blake's desire to mock you. Attribute point +1. You crushed the bodyguard's desire to teach you a lesson. Attribute point +1. You crushed Blake's desire to not have his nose broken. Attribute point +1. You've satisfied the interest of the people around you watching the show. Wish value +1. You've neutralized the desire of the people around you to persuade you to stop fighting. Attribute point +1. Total free attribute points 4. Total wish value 3 of 10.
The system notifications continued ringing in Keith's mind as Blake wailed helplessly on the ground. Keith looked down at him with disdain and sneered. "Who's finished now, huh?" But Blake didn't answer. Other than the sound of him groaning in pain, the scene was deathly silent. Keith turned to look at Christina, whose face had drained of all color. He snorted and turned to leave, but suddenly, a woman in a police uniform emerged from the crowd. The newcomer looked to be in her mid-20s. She had an elegant, dignified appearance, and her face was calm. Even in her police uniform, she was breathtakingly beautiful. She walked over slowly, and her eyes traveled to the man on the ground. She frowned and looked back up at Keith. "Keith, what's going on here?" She was the sergeant in the team Keith worked in, and thus his immediate superior. Her name was Quinn Taylor. She was famous for being one of the best and strictest officers on the force. She held her team to the highest standards, and herself even more so. Keith was stunned for a moment when he saw her, but he quickly regained his composure and dropped his cold demeanor. He chuckled lightly as he said to her, "Sergeant Taylor, what are you doing here? I was just dealing with the dispute." "Dispute?" Quinn frowned and furrowed her eyebrows slightly. She'd only just arrived at the scene and had no idea what had happened. Blake, still lying helplessly on the ground, looked at Quinn with a ray of hope and shouted, "Officer, I'm Blake Carrington. This man broke my nose and was about to kill me. Arrest him." "Huh?" Quinn turned to Keith and whispered, "What the hell's going on here?" Keith exhaled heavily. It's kind of difficult to explain, Sergeant. We should probably get him to a doctor first." Quinn nodded and looked over to the edge of the crowd. The hospital security had already arrived with a number of EMTs. "Over here," Quinn called out to them. "Looks like we got a broken nose." Hearing the officer's orders, the EMTs hurried over. As they loaded Blake onto a stretcher, he wailed at Quinn. "My father's taxes pay your wages, officer. You better have an explanation for this." Quinn gave Blake a sharp look and said, "Mr. Carrington, it's the duty of every citizen to pay taxes. My department is here to serve the people, not your father's company. Why should I owe you any kind of explanation? Furthermore," she went on, "right now I'm off duty, so if you want to take this any further, you'll need to call the station." There was a cold righteousness in her words that left no room for judgment. Blake was utterly humiliated, and his expression turned resentful. He glared at Quinn in anger before turning back to Keith. "Just you wait, Sanderberg," he hollered. "I'll sue you till you're bankrupt and have you sent down for life." Keith smirked quietly as he said, "Summer really is full of so many noisy bugs. So annoying. Next time a mosquito dares to buzz in my ear, I'll have no choice but to silence it for good." Keith's voice slowly became cold again, and his eyes bore sharply into Blake. Blake's broken nose throbbed unbearably, and he shuddered. He was overwhelmed with emotions, pain, fear, and humiliation, until he became so angry that he fainted. Christina wiped the tears from her eyes and looked at Keith. Then she hurried away after Blake. The show was finally over. Most of the crowd was afraid of Keith, and they glanced at him one last time before going their separate ways. Quinn looked at him in concern and asked, "Keith, is your head all right?" Keith laughed and replied with a smile, "Thank you for your concern, Sergeant. I'm fine." "Okay, well, that's good to hear. Come on, let's take a walk." The moon was shining brightly in the sky as Quinn walked with Keith through the hospital garden. She frowned at him and asked, "What happened just now? You broke Blake Carrington's nose?"